Most of us were taught that Jordan was a country drawn on a map. After the First World War, the Ottoman Empire collapsed. Britain and France divided its Arab provinces between them, and a group of officials in a hotel in Cairo sat down with a pencil and invented countries: Iraq, Palestine, and a strip of desert east of the Jordan River that had never been a country and had no obvious reason to become one. Britain needed somewhere to put a spare Arab prince. It had one to spare, so it drew a line, handed the land to Abdullah, the son of the Sharif of Mecca, and called it Transjordan. A foreign prince, a borrowed throne, an artificial state. There is even a sentence that goes with the story. Churchill, it is said, created Transjordan with the stroke of a pen one Sunday afternoon in Cairo. You will find that line in 100 books and 1,000 articles. You will almost never find it with a footnote attached. It is a tidy story. It is also dangerously incomplete, and in the one detail that matters most, it is flat out wrong, because Abdullah was not installed. Britain did not summon him to Transjordan, and Britain did not invent his ambitions. According to one commonly cited estimate, he arrived with roughly 300 men and 6 machine guns, and he was not coming to be a king. He was coming to fight France. What Britain did was turn an intervention it had not asked for into a government it could afford to keep. And the price of that arrangement is the real beginning of this story: £5,000 a month. The version of this history that treats the map as the crime misses what was actually happening in London in the winter of 1920. It was not imperial appetite. It was panic about money. Britain still wanted the interests an empire gives you. It had simply concluded that it could no longer defend them the expensive way, and that a subsidized local ruler was cheaper than a garrison. That is the argument of this video. If a state begins as a budget line, it does not stop being one when the flag goes up. Before we go anywhere, here is what is coming. A British officer, 23 years old, who invented a country called the National Government of Moab, and appointed himself its president. A prince who got off a train in the southern desert with a private army and an intention to invade Syria. A revolt in Iraq that cost the treasury tens of millions and frightened a government into changing how it ruled. A paragraph in a League of Nations document that gave a country its own legal shape by listing the rules that would not apply inside it. A pipeline and a town in the eastern Jordanian desert that grew up around pumping station number 5. And the year Britain finally stopped paying the bills, and the very short number of months it took for somebody else to start. So let's go back, not to 1921 and not to Cairo, but to 1878 and to a group of refugees arriving at a ruin. In the spring of 1878, families of Circassian Muslims, driven out of the North Caucasus by the Russian Empire, were settled by Ottoman officials among the collapsed Roman columns of a place called Amman. There was no town there. There had not been one for centuries. Historians estimate the North Caucasian refugee population of the whole region at somewhere around 6,000 people, and roughly half of them ended up in that one settlement. Understand why the Ottoman state bothered. This was not charity. Istanbul was converting land it nominally owned into land it could actually tax, and the Land Code of 1858 had built the registration system to do it. A nomadic population pays almost nothing. A settled grain-selling population pays every year, forever. The refugees were given free land and a temporary exemption from taxes and conscription, and the treasury acquired a new class of taxpayers on a frontier it had spent generations failing to control. This is the part of the story that gets skipped. There was a state east of the Jordan before the British arrived. It was Ottoman, it was expanding, and it ran on revenue. Salt became an administrative center. Kerak was brought under direct provincial administration in 1893 with a garrison and a tax register, and then came the railway. The Hijaz Railway was one of the strangest infrastructure projects of the 19th century because it was built without European loans. Roughly a third of the cost came from donations, from the Sultan's own purse down to Muslims in India and Ottoman households paying a small poll tax, with more than 20,000 individual donors recorded by name. It was a crowd-funded railway, and it was built that way on purpose, because the Ottomans had learned what foreign railway loans did to a treasury. The line reached central Transjordan in 1903 and Medina in 1908, and it did something to Amman that no proclamation could have done. It turned a refugee village into a market. Grain from the Balka Plateau that had taken days to move by guarded caravan could now reach Damascus in a day, and you can watch the effect in the price of commercial property. In the Circassian quarter of Amman, the price of a shop rose from 543 kurus in the 1890s to 6,839 kurus on the eve of the First World War. That is more than a 12-fold increase in about 20 years, in a town that still held only a few thousand people. Hold on to that number. 12-fold. The standard story says this was empty land that Britain filled with a country. It was not empty. It was a functioning, taxed, rail-connected periphery of a state that was about to be destroyed by a war it lost. What destroyed that periphery was the same event that is supposed to have created Jordan. The Ottoman collapse left a region where the taxes stopped being collected and nobody was sure who was owed them. Faisal, Abdullah's younger brother, had ridden into Damascus in 1918 and set up an Arab government in Syria. In March 1920, a Syrian Congress proclaimed him king. 4 months later, the French army marched on Damascus, broke his forces at Maysalun in July, and threw him out. Faisal, the king of Syria, became Faisal, a man on a train with no country. And the land east of the Jordan River, which had been administered from Damascus, was suddenly administered from nowhere at all. Britain's mood that winter is the part the conventional narrative gets badly wrong. We picture an empire at its peak. Britain was at its largest territorial extent in history and simultaneously closer to fiscal breakdown than it had been in a century. The war had cost it everything. Britain had gone from the world's greatest creditor to a debtor of the United States. National debt had risen from roughly £650 million before the war to over £7 billion afterwards, more than tenfold. Then the post-war boom broke. Unemployment in Britain passed 2 million. And in the middle of that, in the summer of 1920, the population of Mesopotamia rose in revolt against British occupation. The revolt was crushed. The bill was politically and fiscally intolerable. British military operations in Iraq cost the Treasury somewhere between 40 and 50 million pounds, more than the entire British subsidy to the Arab revolt against the Ottomans during the war. Over 400 British and Indian soldiers were killed. Older estimates of Iraqi dead ran as high as 10,000, and the figure is still disputed. Read the British press of that winter, and you will not find a debate about civilization or mandates. You will find arithmetic. A country with 2 million unemployed was spending tens of millions a year holding a desert it had occupied 18 months earlier. In 1922, the government would appoint the Geddes Committee and take an axe to public spending. The mood that produced Jordan was the mood that produced those cuts. In January 1921, Winston Churchill was moved to the Colonial Office. He was given a specific brief, and it was not a noble one. Reduce the cost of the Middle East. Everything that happened next follows from that sentence. The solution had two halves. The first was aviation. Hugh Trenchard, head of the Royal Air Force, argued that a mandate could be policed from the air by squadrons and armored cars instead of divisions, at a fraction of the price. In October 1922, the RAF took over responsibility for Iraq with 8 squadrons and 4 armored car companies. The second half was cheaper still. Instead of governing Arabs with British officials, Britain would back Arab rulers and pay for the governments they ran. That was the doctrine. Not conquest, subcontracting. Transjordan is the purest example of it anywhere in the empire, because Transjordan had nothing. No oil, no port, no industry. A population of perhaps 230,000 people in 1921, and no revenue base worth the name. Whatever government existed, there was going to be paid for from London, and everyone involved knew it from the first day. So what did Britain do with this land before Abdullah arrived? Almost nothing, and the almost nothing is one of the strangest episodes in the history of the British Empire. It sent a handful of officers across the river with no troops, no budget, and instructions to encourage local self-government. In practice, that meant young British officers turning up in individual towns and helping invent individual governments. At Carrick, in the south, the officer was Alec Kirkbride. He was 23 years old. With what one account calls a fine sense of history, he named the polity he had helped create the national government of Moab after the biblical kingdom and served as its president. His entire coercive apparatus was about 50 Arab policemen. His brother Alan did something similar at Ammon and called it the Ammonite government. There was a third arrangement at Salt. It is easy to make this sound more absurd than it was. These were not fantasies imposed on unwilling people. They were improvisations built on top of existing local notables in a region that had just lost the administration in Damascus. But the fact remains that in the winter of 1920, the future kingdom of Jordan was 3 small self-declared governments. One of them was named after a kingdom that had ceased to exist around 400 years before Christ, presided over by a young Englishman with 50 policemen. Kirkbride would stay in the country, in one role or another, for 30 years, deputy resident, then British minister, and finally ambassador until 1951. He was there at the beginning and he was there at the end. Remember that. And then, in November 1920, a train arrived at Ma'an. Abdullah bin Hussein was the second son of the Sharif of Mecca. He had been promised things during the war that had not been delivered, had expected a throne in Iraq, and had watched his brother thrown out of Damascus by the French, Ma'an, in the far south, was at that moment administered as part of his father's kingdom of the Hijaz. So when Abdullah stepped off that train on the 21st of November, 1920, with roughly 300 men and 6 machine guns, he was not invading anything. He was standing on his father's territory, announcing his intention to march north and take Syria back from France. Consider how that looked from London. A son of Britain's wartime ally is sitting in the desert with a small army, announcing a war against France, a country with which Britain has just finished fighting a world war on the same side, in a region Britain cannot afford to garrison. He moved north to Amman in March 1921. He had still not been offered anything. 10 days later, Churchill's conference opened at the Semiramis Hotel in Cairo. Everyone remembers it for Iraq, for Gertrude Bell and T.E. Lawrence, and the decision to make Faisal king in Baghdad. Transjordan was the smaller item on the agenda, and it was settled the way you settle a small item. Abdullah would be allowed to administer the territory east of the Jordan on a trial basis for 6 months, backed by £5,000 a month. Late in March in Jerusalem, Churchill met Abdullah in person, and the arrangement was confirmed. It matters what that money actually was. Some of the historical literature calls it a personal subsidy to Abdullah, while British parliamentary discussion of Transjordan's finances describes the wider contribution as a grant in aid to the administration and its security force. It was more than an allowance for one man. British money helped sustain the government he ran and the armed force his rule depended on. £60,000 a year. Set that beside the 40 to 50 million the Iraqi revolt had just cost, and the entire logic of British policy in the Middle East between the wars compresses into a single ratio. Suppressing one rebellion in Iraq cost roughly what it would cost to keep a friendly government in Transjordan for the better part of 7 centuries. The emirate was formally established that April. The 6-month trial was never seriously reviewed. It simply continued, the way temporary arrangements do when they are working. Abdullah would rule that territory for the next 30 years. There is a legal step here that almost nobody outside the specialist knows about, and it is the closest thing the story has to a founding document. It is not a declaration of independence. It is a list of exceptions. Transjordan sat inside the British mandate for Palestine. That created an obvious problem, because the mandate carried the Balfour Commitment to a Jewish national home, and Britain had no intention of applying it east of the river. So the mandate was written with a safety hatch. Article 25 allowed Britain to postpone or withhold specified provisions in the territory east of the Jordan. On the 16th of September, 1922, the Council of the League of Nations approved a British memorandum that pulled that lever. The memorandum defined the territory with the flat precision of a surveyor. It meant everything east of a line running from a point 2 miles west of Aqaba, up the center of the Wadi Araba, the Dead Sea, the River Jordan, and then the Yarmouk to the Syrian frontier. And it listed the articles of the mandate that would not apply there, 6 in full, along with parts of the preamble and of 3 more. Look at what that document does. It did not conjure a country into existence. It gave an emerging Transjordanian administration a distinct legal framework by specifying which mandate provisions would not apply east of the Jordan, and it left that administration under general British supervision. In one important legal sense, Transjordan's founding charter is a schedule of exclusions, and it worked. In May 1923, Britain formally recognized Transjordan as a state being prepared for independence under Abdullah. The recognition changed the letterhead. It did not change the accounts. That leaves the question the tidy version never asks. Why bother? Why does an empire that is cutting everything in the worst fiscal position of its modern history spend a single pound on a place with no oil, no port, and no revenue? Part of the answer is that the value was never in the land. It was in what had to cross it. The overland link from the Mediterranean to the Persian Gulf ran across exactly this ground. From 1921, the RAF operated an air route from Cairo to Baghdad, and because there was nothing in the desert to navigate by, they plowed a furrow across it, hundreds of miles of track scraped into the ground so pilots could follow the line. Landing grounds were laid out along it and given letters and numbers. H for the Haifa route. The air route mattered immediately. The oil pipeline came more than a decade later, so it was not a reason Transjordan was created in 1921. What it shows is how strategically useful that corridor had already become. And the oil was never Jordanian because there was none. It was Iraqi oil that needed to reach the Mediterranean. The Iraq Petroleum Company built a twin pipeline from Kirkuk between 1932 and 1934 at a cost of around $50 million, designed to carry 30 million barrels a year. It forked. One branch ran north to Tripoli in French Lebanon, the other ran southwest across Transjordan to Haifa. The first oil reached Tripoli in July 1934 and Haifa that October. Within a year, the system was delivering 27,014,904 barrels. The pipeline needed pumping stations, built where nothing else was. Two of them, H4 and H5, stood in the Transjordanian desert, with generators, workshops, water, housing, and an airstrip, in a landscape that had none of those things. People came and stayed. The town of Safawi grew around pumping station H5, and it is still there. The pipeline is not. When the State of Israel was established in 1948, the Haifa branch was cut off from Iraqi crude and abandoned. The oil stopped, the town did not. I find that one of the most honest images in the whole history of the modern Middle East. A settlement in the desert, grown up around a numbered pump on a line that stopped pumping before most of its residents were born. So Britain was not simply backing a ruler. Among the interests it was securing was a corridor linking Palestine, Iraq, and the wider imperial network, and the bill for keeping a friendly government on it began at £60,000 a year. In Transjordan, the army was the state. In October 1920, a British officer named Frederick Peake began building a force there. It started at about 150 men. Under a series of names, it became the Arab Legion, the only institution in the country with a national reach. It was commanded by British officers and paid for by Britain. In 1926, it was cut back to around 900 men, and a separate British-controlled unit, the Transjordan Frontier Force, was raised alongside it. In 1930, an officer named John Bagot Glubb arrived, and in March 1939 he took command. He held it for 17 years. Under Glubb, the force grew from about 1,600 men during the Second World War to roughly 6,000 by 1948. Within a decade, it was past 20,000. It became, by most assessments, the most effective Arab army of its era. Its commander was British, its budget was British, and the arrangement was written down. The Anglo-Transjordanian Agreement, signed at Jerusalem on the 20th of February 1928, is one of the more revealing documents of the Mandate period, precisely because it is so unembarrassed. Article 5 required the Emir to be guided by British advice in all matters concerning foreign relations and financial obligations. Article 6 required that the annual budget and any law affecting currency or customs duties or the organic law itself be referred for British approval. Two further articles confirmed that Britain could maintain and raise whatever forces it judged necessary, with Transjordan gradually assuming the cost. A sovereign is a person who decides the budget. Under Article 6, that person was in London. None of this was secret, and it was not experienced as humiliation by everyone involved. Abdullah was not a puppet in the cartoon sense. He used the money, the legion, and the British connection to do things Britain did not particularly want, and he spent 30 years pursuing an ambition London found alarming, which was a greater Syria under his own crown. But the accounts are the accounts. In 1928, the Emirates' budget was approved in another country. The argument I have just made you is contested by very good historians, and the contest is more interesting than either side alone. For decades, the orthodox line was close to the one I opened with. Jordan was an artificial state, a British invention. Uriel Dan and a generation of scholars working mainly from British archives produced a Jordan that existed because Britain willed it and survived because Britain paid. Then in 1987, Mary C. Wilson published King Abdullah, Britain, and the Making of Jordan, and the picture bent. Wilson took Abdullah seriously as a political actor with his own project rather than as a client, and in her account, the emirate is a joint product of a British budget and a Hashemite ambition. Then in 1999 came the book that did the most damage to the artificial state thesis. Eugene Rogan's Frontiers of the State in the late Ottoman Empire showed that the Ottoman state had spent 70 years building administration in that territory, land registration, tax assessment, refugee settlement, garrisons at Salt and Kerak, a railway. The institutions the British inherited were not absent. They were Ottoman. And in 2007, Yoav Alon's The Making of Jordan added a third leg, a state built through sustained bargaining with the tribal sheikhs of the interior, who were not passive objects of colonial administration, but parties who extracted terms. So there are three answers to what made Jordan a British subsidy, a Hashemite prince, an Ottoman inheritance, and a tribal bargain. My own reading is that Rogan and Alon are right that Jordan was not conjured out of nothing. But the revision has a limit, and the limit is the ledger. Ottoman administration explains why there were institutions to work with. It does not explain why the border runs down the Wadi Araba, or why the ruler was a Hijazi prince with no prior connection to the territory, or why the army answered to a British general until 1956. The objection to that is worth stating. Emphasizing the subsidy risks, reproducing the very condescension the revisionists set out to correct, in which Arabs appear as recipients and the British Treasury as the only actor with agency. A budget is a constraint, not a script. Plenty of states have been financed from abroad and gone on to do things their financiers hated, and Jordan is one of them. But a constraint that lasts 36 years is not a detail. It is a structure. Now, let me bring all of these threads together, because the pattern only appears when you put them side by side. An empire that had won a war and lost its solvency, carrying a national debt more than 10 times its pre-war level and mass unemployment at home. A revolt in Iraq that cost between 40 and 50 million pounds and taught the government that occupation was the most expensive thing it could do. A colonial secretary appointed in January 1921 with an explicit brief to make the Middle East cheaper. A doctrine of air control and friendly rulers that promised to replace divisions with squadrons. Then, the accident. A prince arrives at Ma'an with his own army and his own war with France, at the precise moment when Britain needs above all things not to have a war in Syria. A settlement of £5,000 a month, agreed as a 6-month experiment and quietly renewed for 3 decades. A memorandum in September 1922 giving the territory its own legal framework. An air route to Baghdad, and later a pipeline to Haifa that made the corridor worth holding. And an army founded on 150 men, commanded by British officers for a generation, with its budget approved in London. Any one of those facts is a footnote, put them in order, and they are a design. None of it was done to build a nation. Many of the decisive choices were made to reduce a cost. The prince avoided a campaign. The subsidy avoided a garrison. The air route avoided an army. Those choices served other purposes too, in Palestine, in Iraq, and in Britain's long relationship with the Hashemite family. But cost is the thread that runs through all of them. Jordan was not founded so much as economized into existence. There were people living on that corridor, and the arrangement had a texture on the ground. Consider what it meant to be a villager in the Balka, or a sheikh in the south in the 1920s. Your grandfather had paid taxes to Istanbul, and the collector came with a garrison behind him. Now the government in Amman was a prince who had arrived 3 years earlier with a personal following from another country, and the money that paid for it came from elsewhere. When you resisted, and there were serious revolts in the early years, the force that came was officered by Englishmen and financed from a treasury 2,000 miles away. And consider the men who worked at those pumping stations. Oil moved out of Iraq, across their country, to a port in Palestine for a company registered in London. None of the crude in the pipe was theirs, though the transit brought work and infrastructure that had not existed there before. Generators, a clinic, water, an airstrip, wages. Then the oil stopped, and the wages stopped, and the town stayed, because by then people had been born there. Safawi is still on the map as a road junction in the eastern desert, grown up around a pump. That is the human residue of a corridor state. Infrastructure built for someone else's transit, inhabited afterwards by the people who serviced it. Abdullah's own ending belongs in the same register. On the 20th of July 1951, he went to Friday prayers at the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem, in a city his army had held since the War of 1948, and was shot dead at the entrance. Alec Kirkbride, the young man who had run the national government of Moab with 50 policemen, was by then the British ambassador. The man and the state had the same arc, from a schoolboy improvisation to an assassination in 3 decades. Britain kept paying. Then, quite suddenly, it stopped. In March 1956, the young King Hussein dismissed Glubb and the other British senior officers of the Arab Legion. In 1957, the Anglo-Jordanian Treaty was terminated and the British subsidy ended. That is 36 years in which the operating budget of a sovereign state was a line item in the accounts of another country. And here is the number that tells you what actually happened next. It did not take years for a replacement to appear. It took months. American assistance moved in almost immediately, and it has never left. There is a body of scholarship that describes exactly this condition, and it is worth knowing the name of it. In 1987, the economists Hazem Biblawi and Giacomo Luciani published a collection called The Rentier State. Their argument was that when a government's income comes from outside its own economy, whether from oil or from strategic rent paid by a foreign power, the whole relationship between rulers and ruled changes shape. A government funded by its own citizens must bargain with them. A government funded from abroad has to satisfy the funder first. Jordan has never had oil. It has had the other kind of rent continuously since 1921. In the 2024 United States fiscal year, American aid obligations to Jordan came to about $1.82 billion, roughly 3/4 of it economic assistance rather than military. When American aid programs were abruptly disrupted in recent years, the effect on Jordanian budgets was immediate and public, which is exactly what you would expect of a structure that has been in place for 104 years. This is where an argument like this usually turns into a sneer, and it should not. Jordan is not a fiction. It has an army that is its own, a national identity people have died for, and it has absorbed waves of refugees on a scale that would have broken larger states. The point is not that the country is unreal. The point is that the financing structure it was born with never went away. The creditor changed, the arrangement did not. And the pattern is not unique to Jordan. Look at the states created by outside powers in the 20th century for reasons of transit, containment, or convenience. Many are still 3 and 4 generations later, dependent on external transfers for their basic solvency, and still explaining to their own citizens why the budget is negotiated somewhere else. The founding bargain outlives everybody who made it. The next time someone tells you that Britain drew Jordan on a map and installed a foreign prince, you will know better. Britain did not summon him. He arrived with his own men and his own war, at the worst possible moment for a bankrupt empire. What Britain did was turn that arrival into a subsidized system of indirect rule because it protected British interests at a fraction of the cost of occupation. Follow the money and the founding story inverts. This was not an empire expanding. It was an empire retreating, as cheaply as it could, and leaving a state behind as the receipt. If this is the kind of history you want more of, the version with the invoices left in, subscribe. This channel follows the debts, the deals, and the quiet payments underneath the events you were taught as politics. And I want your argument on one thing. Of everything here, which mattered most in making Jordan the country it became? The Ottoman administration that was already there, the £5,000 a month, the air route, and the pipeline, or Abdullah himself, arriving without a British invitation? Tell me in the comments, and tell me why. I read every single one of them. And if this changed how you see that border, a like helps it find the people who would want it.